Pawatlo. This is David Cobb, co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. Welcome back to Decolonizing Economics, from Earth Day to May Day. It is my distinct pleasure to bring the next panel to you. Lauren Regan is going to be facilitating what I think is one of the most important sessions for on-the-ground activists happening today. That's because Lauren is going to be giving us a session on state repression in this moment. And for her and the folks at the Civil Liberties Defense Center, they understand that state repression can take the form of both government and corporations. In 2003, Lauren Regan, who serves as the CLDC's executive director and staff attorney, in partnership with a group of other environmental and social justice activists and attorneys, founded the Civil Liberties Defense Center. The creation was an urgent response to a growing and increasingly crucial need for education and legal assistance within the progressive change movement. This happened in the post-September 11th era, in which decrees like the PATRIOT Act and others were put into place. CLDC immediately developed a number of legal representation, education, and outreach programs, offering free and reduced-rate legal assistance to activists, conducted national media interviews and commentary, and monitored and challenged repressive legislation in the courts. Their legal know-how, their ability to effectively translate legalese and litigation expertise provided a foundation that activists can and do rely on to tackle the tough issues that they're confronting. Additionally, the trainings they organize weave together activist skills, instill a sense of confidence and awareness on what to expect from interactions with law enforcement and counter-protesters. CLDC is not only on the ground and behind the scenes. They're tracking trends about the historic arc of the state repression against activists. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Lauren Regan.
Thanks. Thank you very much, David. And thanks everybody for having me today. Very excited to be here. And yeah, as David mentioned, my hope today is to focus on state repression as it relates to political activists. Basically, kind of a short version of one of many Know Your Rights trainings that we do for movement participants, primarily environmental and social justice activists. Our organization is anti-capitalist. Many of us identify as anarchists or far leftists, and we are abolitionists as well. So I'm gonna share my screen and show you some slides as I kind of like walk through, just some basic information around what we mean when we say state repression and what we can do about it. A lot of people, when they hear that term, when they think about government surveillance, it's all kind of scary boogeyman topics that most people sort of want to cover their ears and, kind of crawl into a small cave. But the reason that we want to talk about this information is because, the government certainly knows it. And there are actually lots of things that we can do as activists to make our community safer and to protect us from some of the worst consequences of state repression. So when we're talking about sort of the legal landscape in this world, and we're talking about, why we should know what our rights are, or why we should have trainings like this. One of the first things that we hope to instill in people is the ability to think on their own feet. The ability to engage in your own risk assessment. Because when we're talking about state repression and digital security and these kinds of topics, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. If I'm planning a bake sale, I don't need to use the level of precautions or security that I would use if I was planning a political action that I wanted to keep away from my adversaries. In the same way, we're also hoping to basically help give people skills with regard to like harm reduction or harm mitigation in the legal landscape. Meaning sometimes, we've certainly seen this week, sometimes people choose to get arrested. But there are things that we can do to ensure that the power of the state doesn't, come crashing down on them in the worst possible ways. This will ensure that we can both better protect ourselves and protect our communities and often the most vulnerable people in those communities. Finally, over decades as political movements, we have gained strength and power against Big Brother, against government and corporations. And we don't want to have to go back to square one. We want to be moving forward, with those strengths and with those gains. And so by ensuring that we understand our history, we will not be bound to repeat it, so to speak. Oftentimes when I talk about this topic, I will have somebody in the audience basically say, well, I'm not doing direct action. I'm not doing anything illegal. Why should I care about this topic? And I really think Edward Snowden, said it best when he said, when you say, I don't care about the right to privacy because I have nothing to hide, that is no different than saying, I don't care about freedom of speech because I have nothing to say, or freedom of press because I have nothing to write. Now we do a whole separate training on knowing your rights and how to engage with cops. And this slide is basically what we call our magic words. These are the basic ways to assert your constitutional rights when you're engaging with police or government agents. If you are stopped by the cops, whether it's in your car or on the streets, the first thing that you want to ask them is, am I being detained? Because the answer to that question basically tells you whether or not you're free to walk away or whether or not you have to remain with the cop. And also it tells you whether or not you have to identify yourself or not. So am I being detained? Why am I being detained? And no matter what the answer to those questions are, you can always say, I don't consent to this search, exercising your Fourth Amendment right. Even if you think that the cops have a lawful right to search you, you still want to say, I don't consent to the search because it gives lawyers something to fight about in the event that you end up in court. And then finally, invoking your Fifth Amendment right, that taking the fifth, as you might have heard, on TV, by saying the words, I'm going to remain silent and I want a lawyer. That puts a magic bubble around you that basically requires the cops to stop questioning you. Now, in talking about state repression specifically, a couple of resources for folks that want to do a deeper dive into this. Tilted Scales Collective, we wrote some guides. One is a defendant's guide to being a defendant. There's also a guide for lawyers in representing political activists. Green is the New Red. And if you haven't seen the documentary, If a Tree Falls, that's sort of your deeper dive into an era of state repression that Tony and I lived through up here in Cascadia, which was when the largest roundup of Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front activists occurred at the hands of the federal government after 9/11 and after the passage of the PATRIOT Act. So to sort of set the stage, I wanted to define what is the state, because people can mean different things by this. But as David mentioned, to us, the state refers to both government and corporations. And part of the reason that we believe that to be true is because there is a revolving door of CEOs that go become cabinet members in the federal government or go, lead federal agencies and then leave and go back to their corporate CEO jobs and then come back into government. We know that those two entities are in bed together and they are really in place to facilitate each other's profit motivations and to ensure that the US remains a real strong capitalist, bulwark basically for profiteering. So now that we've defined the state, you know, what I believe, I feel like we pick teams, and you're either on the teams of the state or you're on the team of movements. And it's important for people to pick a team, because the state generally is the adversary for almost every environmental or social justice movement or campaign that exists. You are either fighting against corporations in some way, or you're fighting against government agencies. And the state has a lot of power and resources on its side. But what we have that the state will never have is passion, ethics. We have volunteers that do this work for free. They are not working 9 to 5 and collecting a paycheck in order to do this work. And often, the state is just bewildered and confused by, people who do things for free, people who do things on the weekends. We constantly hear corporations, especially in like pipeline contexts, basically saying like somebody must be paying these people to get arrested. Someone must be telling them what to do. They constantly are trying to put social justice movements into a hierarchy that they understand, like a corporate structure. And for all of those reasons, the nimble, agile, creative, morally high ground, versions of movements are what, give us the people power to have lasted, as long as we have. Back in 2008, during the Republican National Convention, hundreds of activists, environmental and social justice activists from across the spectrum of our movement spaces got together and came up with a consensus-based set of principles on how different organizations, different movements, using all sorts of different strategies and tactics could come together in a single geographic location and harmonize our tactics and our interests. And so the St. Paul principles were created then, but they remain incredibly strong and vibrant today, even in our current moment of of occupations and encampments around the country against the genocide in Gaza and beyond. And so the St. Paul principles, our solidarity will be based on a respect for a diversity of tactics and the plans of other groups. The actions and tactics used will be organized to maintain a separation of time or space. This basically means if you're doing a noise demo, I'm not going to have my silent vigil, 3 feet away from you. For instance, Black Bloc and Raging Grannies probably shouldn't be in the exact same physical proximity of each other, both for tactic and safety reasons. Any debates or criticisms will stay internal to the movement, avoiding any public or media denunciations of fellow activists and events. Shit talking each other's tactics is just what the state wants us to do. That divide and conquer mentality is a win for them. And especially in the advent of social media, there are cops and government agencies that do nothing except sit in front of computer screens all day, monitoring social media, and just looking for the Achilles heel of a particular campaign or movement that they can exploit. And we'll talk about that more. And finally, we oppose any state repression of dissent, including surveillance, infiltration, disruption, and violence. We agree not to assist law enforcement actions against activists and others. So when I use the word state repression, it actually means a lot of things. There are many different forms of state repression, like legislation, unlawful arrests and excessive bail, overcharging people or over punishing them, surveillance, the use of grand juries as witch hunts, slap suits, and RICO actions, which we'll talk about a little bit more. All of these are tools of the bully, of state power that are intended to try to break the backs of social movements. Each one of these things is nothing new. This has been going on since the history of movement spaces, and we have developed ways to dance around some of the worst, obstacles of these. for students or younger people that are perhaps listening to this, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to know our history. The saying, know your history or you're bound to repeat it, is really true. The state has a pretty limited playbook that they keep reusing and recycling. And so knowing what the state came at people with, during the 60s, the 70s, the 50s, these older eras is really instructive, because we are seeing many of the same things again, particularly in the moment we're in. Everybody's been seeing the news and talking about the 1968 Vietnam War protests at Columbia, for instance, as compared to, now, and the anti-war protests on behalf of the people of Gaza. Even in the same buildings, the same type of protests are going on. Knowing what worked and what didn't work makes us a stronger movement in the current moment. And as I mentioned, state repression has a long history that ebbs and flows. There are moments of heightened state repression, and there have been moments where there have been lulls. But state repression against political activists over the history of the United States has included assassinations. It has included lengthy imprisonment. Our movements have had and have martyrs currently. It's important to plan for the worst and hope for the best whenever you are engaging in environmental and social justice change. Taking just a brief look at legislation, we have seen a flood of anti-protest legislation over the last, 5 to 7 years. What's important to know about all of this anti-protest legislation, however, is that many activists engaged in civil disobedience or direct action knowingly plan to break the law. It really doesn't matter what the name of the law is that they are going to be charged with. We cannot control what a prosecutor ultimately charges us with. We may think that we're engaging in trespassing, and the state can charge you with RICO. So when activists go into engaging in direct action or civil disobedience, we try to give a range of risks, and we hope that people have knowledge and consent when they make the decision to engage in those risks. But there's always the chance that the state is going to try and escalate its bully tactics. When you see that, when you see a flood of legislation, like what is happening right now, when you see things like what is happening down in Atlanta with regard to Cop City, you should think in your head, this is happening because we are winning. When you see the bully kind of pull out the stops, it's because they are on the losing end of the court of public opinion. They are attempting to retake control of the narrative by trying to convince normies that protest is criminal, that protest is bad, and that what they're doing in raping and pillaging the environment and society is actually righteous and good. And so it's, the other reason that you will see these kinds of floods happening is truly to chill the First Amendment right to assemble, to associate, to come together and use collective power to make change. These are principled constitutional rights that are at the core of any healthy democracy. We know that we don't have a particularly healthy democracy at this moment, but when people say to me, I'm afraid of these new anti-protest laws that are coming out, I understand that, and that is 100% the intent of the state and their lobbyists to be passing those laws. When you see bully tactics like that happening, one of the best general frames to be thinking about is, if they think that what they're going to do is going to scare us into submission, the best antidote for that is to redouble our efforts and make sure that the state knows that that as a tactic is not a winner for them. If they think that they have found something that is actually winning for them, you will see them use it time and time again. If we do our best to neutralize that tactic and to even show maybe a little bit of a fake smile, maybe we really are scared, that is normal, but we want to make sure that to the state and to the larger public that we do our best to not show fear, to not show that this is a tactic that will cause harm to our movements, that will actually provide the chill that the state is looking to create. Groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Federalist Society, and other basically, lobbyist bootlickers for massive industries and corporations are constantly attempting to undermine our democracy by passing model legislation that they sell basically to state legislators, hoping to pass new state laws. They focus on the state because and by that I mean Oregon, California state, not the larger state. They focus on states because they expect that state legislators have less capacity, less staff. They're going to be more reliant on having these outside lobbyists tell them, hey, go pass this law. We wrote it for you. It's great. It's just what you wanted. Go get it passed in your legislature. Also, they expect that there's less scrutiny, less potential attention that can be focused on every state. If this is an area that you are interested in, I would really direct you to ICNL, the Center for Not-for-Profit Law. They have a anti-protest law tracking infrastructure on their website. This map that I'm showing you is actually from 2019, but it's just an example of one of the things that the ICNL tracks. By issue area, by state, you can look at bills that are pending, bills that have passed, bills that have failed. I'll tell you, the overarching number of bills more often than not fail. More often than not, they are not getting passed in most states. Of course, there are some areas like Alabama, Oklahoma that are really having some struggles right now in terms of bad laws that are being passed. The thing that is important to think about when we're looking at some of these new laws, though, is not the name of them, not what the state, wants to further criminalize, but really, is it a misdemeanor or is it a felony? Because that's really kind of where the focus should be. Felony risks and felony convictions can have more serious consequences than misdemeanors. Generally speaking, activism and misdemeanors, not super scary. When you get into certain felony convictions, however, that can impact licensing, it could impact gun rights, and different things that might be specific to the state that you are in. Just to give you, an example, though, a lot of these bills and a lot of these laws, like this new Georgia domestic terrorism law that was passed after the movement against Cop City became a global, strong political movement. All of a sudden we see Georgia passing this law that basically, they claimed that it was intended to criminalize things like the Boston Marathon bombing, or the 2015 Charleston massacre at a Black AME church. But instead, the first people to ever be prosecuted were young people sleeping in a hammock in a public forest that were there to protest the construction of this horrific cop training facility. So, we see legislators saying they're passing a law for one reason and then using it to criminalize their enemies. But often what we also see is they'll pass laws and then prosecutors will never use them. They'll put them on the books to try to scare us into submission, but they don't actually want to use them in a court because they know that we will file constitutional challenges against many of these laws. And oftentimes we win and these laws get struck from the book. So as the true bullies that they are, they'd like to keep the law on the books as a scare tactic, but they don't want to use it because they know that it's a weak law that might be subject to constitutional challenge, and then they get rid of their little tool. More and more, we're seeing these really broad, overly broad, ambiguous, vague laws being passed that are very ripe for constitutional challenges, that you will see quite a bit of as we move forward in the Atlanta cases. State repression also often will include unlawful arrests and excessive bail. Unlawful arrests, for instance, down at Standing Rock, when that uprising was occurring, we saw tons of people basically being arrested for no reason. They were carted off to jail, their cars were impounded, and then the charges were dropped. The hope is that rounding up people that aren't doing anything wrong and aren't expecting to get arrested is a scare tactic that will keep people away. Their hope was like all these people from California that were heading to North Dakota to join in the protests might be scared away from joining in on those protests because you were just randomly getting cuffed and stuffed. Excessive bail, unlawful arrests can also be used for reasons like data gathering, checking everybody's plates, checking everyone's IDs, and basically putting people into databases and giving them gang affiliations or extremist designations or other things like that. The idea is literally a brute force destruction of movement gains. You're gathering momentum for this protest, and then all of a sudden people are just randomly snatched and imprisoned. Oftentimes we will see sort of a guilt by association situation, which we are absolutely seeing in Atlanta right now, where, they're basically claiming that they're only, snatching up leaders of a movement for no real unknown reason, things like running a bail fund. And that is often going to be the case. Again, whenever you see things like this happening, really think about, is the intention of the state action to derail or demobilize a burgeoning social justice movement? And often reasons we call propaganda is basically, while you're sitting in jail, police departments and the state are issuing press releases because they know that we can't respond while we're in jail. And then finally, toxic reactive anger from cops toward movements that are winning. We've seen that at Standing Rock and of course, Cop City. When you take on the largest cop training facility in the world, in an era where defund and so much scrutiny and open eyes, are occurring with regard to state violence and police misconduct. You expect, when you wave a red flag at that bull, you should expect to get the horns, as the saying goes. And so when you're going after the largest cop training facility in an era where cops are under a lot of negative scrutiny by the public, you expect them to come back with everything they've got in desperation. And that's what we're seeing. Excessive bail is also just a way to try to scare people away from engaging in activity that may risk arrest. Excessive bail is unconstitutional. It violates the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. With the advent of so many incredible bail funds that have happened over the course of many years and across the country, that is our social movement's way of fighting back against the state tactic of excessive bail. They want excessive bail. We fundraise from our members, from our supporters, and we fight back against that tactic. The use of excessive bail keeps people in custody, perpetuates fear. It allows the cops again to, put forth their narrative while other people are incarcerated. And, even though we think that bail funds are amazing and serve so many incredible purposes, it's also real to know and acknowledge that most bail that is paid to the state, some percentage of it here in Oregon, 15% of bail that is paid is kept by the state, even if you are found not guilty. So cops wrongfully arrest you, throw you in jail, you pay $100 bail, they get to keep $15 of it just for the privilege of locking you up. So, make sure you understand, bail and bond and asking to be released on your own recognizance, which means in lieu of paying any money to the state. Just a few, kind of higher profile things that people are talking about these days in terms of like state abuse of power with regard to the criminalization of activists and abuse of, overcharging, things like RICO, racketeering. This is just the definition of federal racketeering, but almost every state also has a RICO statute. And if you have been following along in Atlanta with Cop City, that is the Georgia state RICO statute that is being used there. In my 26 years of being a movement lawyer, this is only the second time that I've known of any activist being criminally charged with RICO in 26 years. So this is still a rare risk, a low risk. And obviously, Atlanta is getting lots of attention. But when you're doing your risk assessments, people should not fear RICO to the extent that like you decide to sit in front of a computer screen and hit like as your form of activism. Riot, also something that was barely ever used in activist cases until Black Lives Matter occurred. And we could have a larger conversation about a movement that was led by Black people, had an overwhelming number of riot charges, and people basically calling, getting food and supplies for your family, was called looting rather than, liberating in many BIPOC communities. Conspiracy charges are the most common charge that activists and organizers face. It literally means two or more people that do anything in furtherance of a crime. If you and I sit at a cafe and I sketch out a map to the bank and we talk about a bank robbery, that is often enough to warrant a criminal conspiracy charge. Now, this is the broadest net that the state can use against activist communities because it is such a low bar. And there's virtually not much you can do, to prevent technically conspiring, in a criminal sense. But do know that obviously the state can't go after 1 million people engaging in that type of activity. It's just that if you are targeted by the state for your incredible organizing work, for your leadership, they often will use conspiracy as the thing to rope you in. They will use conspiracy as a way to target you when and if they want to. Do remember that 98% of speech in the US is protected First Amendment speech. There's very little speech that is actually unprotected. We really self-censor ourselves in the US far more than we need to, often because we don't understand where the line is drawn between free speech and criminalized speech. So defamation is knowingly telling a lie about someone that causes economic harm. Obscenity is where your intention is to sexually arouse someone. And each state has a slightly different definition of obscenity. Fighting words and true threats, I'll talk about a little bit more. But hate speech is 100% protected by the First Amendment. It's only when you combine hate speech with an unlawful act like assault or harassment that it becomes a hate crime. When we're talking about incitement and advocacy of crime, I get up on stage and I say, let's get those pitchforks and go after Trump, type of thing. That is protected First Amendment fiery rhetoric. The Constitution protects the abstract teaching of the moral propriety or even moral necessity for a resort to violence or force. That is protected and is different than preparing a group for violent action. If I get up on stage and I say, let's go get Trump, that's protected speech. If I then hand out pitchforks to each of you and point across the street and say, that's where Trump is, go get him, then I can be held responsible for your actions. That's sort of the distinction between incitement and advocacy. In a post Black Lives Matter timeframe, the courts have kind of come up with a very specific test. A true threat, like saying something like, we should destroy all courthouses. That is generally speaking First Amendment protected. But during Black Lives Matter, because so much was online, we actually did have clients that were prosecuted federally and faced many years in federal prison for things that they were posting in private chats on Facebook and Twitter and other social media that were being highly monitored by the government. So when you're trying to figure out, is what I'm posting a true threat or not, the courts are going to look at both the subjective intent, like what did you actually intend when you wrote that, and the objective intent. What would a reasonable person think you were, intending? Would a reasonable person interpret what you wrote or what you said as threatening? SLAP suits stand for strategic lawsuits against public participation. This is where corporations file frivolous lawsuits against their adversaries to try and shut them up. This again, in many ways is sort of a badge of honor. When a campaign is targeted by a corporation in a SLAP suit, that's because they are so desperate and pathetic and losing that they're attempting to use their unlimited power and money in the courthouse to try and derail your campaign, to try and shut you up. There is a coalition called Protect the Protest that I am a part of, and that over 35 NGOs are a part of, that will represent you for free if you're the target of a SLAP suit. We've got campaigns and comms people that will help, double down on your campaign when it's targeted in this way. And we do a whole separate training on this. Just know that it is a form of state repression, but we are really fighting back hard on this. And in the last 10 years of SLAP lawsuits, CLDC has defended dozens of campaigns, activists, and organizers, and we have gotten every one of them dismissed to date. So yes, it's a risk, but the actual risk of being found liable is somewhat low. And it's still somewhat rare that activists and organizations are being slapped. In order to combat SLAP suits, one of the things that we really try to teach people is about document destruction and retention policies. Having a written policy that says every 30 days you're going to destroy all the drafts that you no longer need, your texts, your emails, all your stuff. The reason that this is important is because if it no longer exists, even if you are slapped, you don't have to worry about turning it over to your enemies, turning it over to your adversaries. Often the reason corporations are slapping activists is because they want to psychologically profile and movement map your campaign. They want to know, how do you pick your targets? How do you fundraise? Who are the leaders? How do you figure out how to run a campaign? They want to learn that so that they can try and fuck with it, to try and destroy it, basically. And so by having fewer documents that exist, you can be like, even if in the worst case scenario I am slapped, I'm doing harm reduction to my movement and my community by getting rid of the stuff that I know that my adversary is hunting for. The goal that they are seeking does not exist on my computer and on my campaign. So take yourself seriously if you are a movement participant. Think about, number one, do I even need to write this down? Should it even be written down? Could the government or a corporation use my words to really negatively harm or impact a campaign or an activist, or an individual? And should you write it down? Should you put it on a crypt pad so that you can destroy one, it for all for one? Be careful in the way you take notes. Do you need to use someone's full legal name? Do you need to put a level of detail together? Sarcasm, if it gets turned over to your enemy, becomes really problematic. And if you engage in some of these things that you actually can control, There are many things when we're talking about state repression that you have power and control over. You can destroy all your old emails so that they don't exist. That is harm reduction to the movement and community. The more of these things that you can do for yourself and your community, the more power you will feel against this big bully. Excessive force or police brutality is also a form of state repression when they, show up in uniforms looking like a bunch of stormtroopers. That is to scare people from joining you, from showing up on the streets, from exercising their First Amendment rights. When they engage in excessive force and police brutality, not only are they breaking the law and violating your civil rights, but they're doing so in order to scare people from joining you, from engaging in movement tactics. So what we're seeing right now, use of force, is basically anything that they are doing, showing up in uniform, using batons, using sound weapons, using chemical weapons. The militarization of our police forces in the US is horrific and historic. This is just basically what cops are trained on. When you go to a cop academy, you are basically told that you can escalate the level of force you use against the people if you can make certain justifications that they lie about. It shouldn't be surprising to anyone here that cops absolutely lie all the time when they are engaging in investigations. They can commit crimes with you, they can do drugs with you, they can lie to you, they can date you, all while infiltrating movement spaces and investigating crimes. Grand juries are also a tool of state repression when they're used against political activists. This too is somewhat rare, but it's a boogeyman to political activists. Especially young organizers often come to me with a lot of fear and apprehension around grand juries. It is very rare that cops and the state will use grand juries and subpoena movement participants because they don't need to. They can just have one cop come in and read from a bunch of reports and spit out a bunch of hearsay. And, the saying is that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich because basically it's a prosecutor in a room with a bunch of grand jurors and a court reporter. Nobody gets to argue the contrary position. And, grand jurors generally want their bathroom breaks. So they're going to do what their friend, the prosecutor tells them to do, which is indict you. Unless, of course, the person that is being grand juried is a cop, for the death of a human, for the murder of a human. And then that prosecutor, who's best friends with the cops, will go to that grand jury and be like, you don't want to indict my friend, the cop. They're just doing their jobs. And so what? They have to kill another person of color that's holding a cell phone. You don't want cops to be afraid to do their jobs, do you? And that's why we very rarely see grand jury indictments against police for the murder of innocent humans. Racial profiling and bias is targeting individuals for police or security detention based on the color of their skin, based on their religion, et cetera, et cetera. Cops like to call this bias-based policing instead of calling it racial profiling, which is what it is. This is just an interesting graph on the number of people incarcerated in the US based on both race and gender. And the Prison Policy Initiative is the source of this graph. If you are into this and want to see more detail, they've got lots of great resources on their website. We have a saying here at the CLDC that awareness is 2 steps ahead and paranoia is 2 steps backward. The reason we say this is because it's extremely difficult to know whether or not your community is being infiltrated by the feds or by cops. It's actually a distraction and an energy suck of energy that basically gets people turning on each other. When the state is trying to make you think you're being spied on, they're trying to increase your paranoia so that you will fear being an activist, you will fear working with others. Being paranoid is a win for the state. And so whenever we are thinking to ourselves, is this person a snitch? Are they an undercover? You know, if you are practicing good security culture that we will talk about in a minute, it really doesn't matter whether you are infiltrated by a government agent. If you're practicing good security culture, you should be able to organize and campaign and be effective in the face of that. And that's not to say that if you're sure you've got a cop in your midst, you shouldn't out them. You know, that's not to say that if you've got people exercising very poor judgment that are just sucking the life out of a campaign and are doing nothing positive and only negative things to your organizing efforts, tell them to leave. You know, as progressive movement spaces, we are not required to work with everyone that shows up. You know, and in moments of climate crisis and, you know, in moments of state repression, it is important to be effective, to be strategic. And if you can't do that with some of the people you're working with, you don't have to work with them. Rather than focusing on, is this person a cop or not, you should be focusing on, is this person effective? Do I trust this person? Can I work with this person? When we're talking about, you know, state repression and surveillance, we want to talk about threat modeling, which sometimes is a new term for activists. It's often used by military and cops and government agencies. But when we're talking about threat modeling, we're talking about articulating, you know, what are our assets? What are the things that we want to keep safe from the state? Who are our adversaries? You know, are they corporations? Are they cops? Are they private security? What are our vulnerabilities? Like, where are the points where the state could cause harm? You know, is it doxing? Is it, you know, spying on your social media accounts? And then what will you do about it? You know, sometimes people are intimidated by engaging in threat modeling. It's kind of a scary term, but by the time you get to the end of this process and you're talking about what can we do about it, it's actually a liberating, exciting, exhilarating experience, because you will realize for most of the assets that you articulate that have vulnerabilities, there actually are workarounds. There are ways for you to be safer and to protect those things. So what do you want to protect? Who do you want to protect it from? How likely is it that you will need to protect it? You know, like if you're organizing a bake sale, probably low risk of that. What are the likely consequences if you fail? You know, how serious is the harm in the event that you fail in protecting those assets? And how much trouble are you willing to go through in order to try to prevent that? You know, if we're talking about life in prison, you better go to as much effort as humanly possible, you know, to prevent that from happening. But, you know, maybe if it's lower risk, you know, or if you are engaged in, you know, really green organizing activities, you know, maybe using things like a VPN or high levels of digital security might not be necessary for everything. So this is just a different visual on assets, threats, vulnerabilities, you know, attacks. You know, cops show up and raid your house. That's an attack. You know, being doxxed is an attack. And then countermeasures. You know, that's that part that I really want you to focus on. Going through this process with your campaign and with your community and figuring out what are the countermeasures that you can all engage in to make yourself safer. You know, security culture is just a set of norms that activists engage in to keep ourselves safer. It includes things like you can always say no to any action at any time. If you don't feel safe, if it's not the right call for you, you don't have to do it. You know, don't be a tattletale. We picked a team. If you're on team movement, if you're on team activist, don't be a snitch and join team state. You can never come back to team movement. You know, once you cross the line and go over to team state, you're never coming back to our political organizing spaces. You've made that choice for life. So if you can't do the time, don't take the risk. You know, if knowledge and consent to the risks that you're taking is imperative in movement spaces. And then think very carefully about your public statements, whether that's on social media or otherwise. They will last forever. They will be downloaded. They can be used against you and others So think twice about what you post, what you write, et cetera, et cetera. Don't ask, don't tell as it applies to movement spaces. Don't tell me about your past criminal activities. I didn't consent to knowing that. And now if the cops or if, a grand jury is convened and I'm subpoenaed, now I have stuff in my head that I didn't want there, that you put there without my consent. That's don't ask, don't tell in a movement space. We are only as strong as our weakest link. That really, really is true in movement spaces. If there's 10 people in my group and all 9 of us delete our emails, we're really careful with our document destruction, but one person doesn't do it, we are only as strong as our weakest link. All the efforts we just did to be safe have been completely undone by that weak link in our chain that did nothing. And so know that if you agree to engage in certain conduct, like deleting your emails, you are taking a serious responsibility, duty to do that, because your other people in your group are relying on you. Their safety is tied to yours. So resisting mass surveillance, government mass surveillance, mass surveillance is premised on the idea that the state wants to consolidate power in itself. The idea that Big Brother is watching, Sauron's eye is just sucking up all this data and information, and they want you to think that they know it all and they have it all. That's sort of like the idea of mass surveillance. But needle in a haystack really is a thing. And mass surveillance creates and reproduces the conditions for the accumulation of more power. That's why every one of us, should take a digital security training. We've got many on our websites for free, because mass surveillance really applies to all of us. Mass surveillance is a political process of domination. The population's ability to have demonstrations or to organize is greatly reduced when people don't have privacy from the prying eyes of state power, from cops, from government agencies. So when people say, oh, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'll just use Google Docs, or I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm going to post all this stuff to Facebook. Think in your head, we are keeping our organizing efforts private because if the state knows everything that we're planning and doing, we have less power. When we talk about the Fourth Amendment and your right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, which includes your writings and your thoughts and things like that, in the digital realm, the only way that we can say, I don't consent to this search is by using encryption. If you're posting things in a setting where the state can just suck it up, you are saying, I consent to the search and seizure of my information by the state. In order to assert the right to privacy, you have to create boundaries that protect against the unreasonable search and seizure. We can't know what information the state may be gathering at any given time, or how it might be used against you or others. But when everyone asserts a desire to protect our privacy, then it's not just radical activists that are singled out, especially those that are normally targeted and marginalized, like communities of color, like trans activists, like anarchists, like, far leftists. Those people are regularly targeted. If we join them in using certain levels of encryption, then they won't be targeted or singled out as easily. Know that the government is using multiple billions of dollars in capturing things like facial recognition. Every picture on the internet is put into a giant database. In fact, I think the last statistic was that every human in the US has 16,000 photos of themselves that are in some of these corporate data mine databases. They're looking at who you are, where you are in the US, what you are doing, and who you're doing it with. This is an example of how the state comes to movement map our communities. This is actually a document from Standing Rock where the state and private security, there were names and actual faces to this as the movement, as the state tried to map the power structures within the movement to fight the Dakota Access Pipeline. Here is a PowerPoint slide that TransCanada gave as a training to FBI, state and local cops all along the pipeline route. They put photos of activists, description of key organizers, and said, keep your eyes out for these people. When they show up in your town, target them, because if you can cut the head off the snake, then you might make the snake less powerful. And again, we're seeing the same tired playbook being used now as it was during the 60s and 70s during the COINTELPRO era. Psychological and movement profiling, intel briefings that name activists and are like, everybody is an extremist and a terrorist, and grandma might firebomb your church tomorrow, and just like all this bullshit that we see in the headlines and in social media that are basically just trying to malign and defame movements that they're afraid of. This is an example of that. This was actually an email sent from private security during the Dakota Access Pipeline, basically saying, go out and look for informants that will either snitch for money or snitch for free. They are literally, this basically says, we win no matter what. If they agree to inform for pay, we get intel. If they tell our pitchman to go F himself, the activists will start wondering who did take the money, and it will cause conflict within the activist groups. So know that this is an overt tactic of the state, to basically offer you money to become a snitch so that you will worry who did take this bait, and so we need to, that is why the St. Paul principles and having solidarity, solidarity is more than just a catchphrase. It really has significant meaning when you are tackling state repression. Facebook, hopefully most people are now off Facebook. This is something we received 2 days ago on behalf of one of our clients. It is basically Google informing that person that everything on their Google account was turned over to the government. All their Google Docs, their Gmail emails, every Google product that you have. This literally happened 2 days ago. Google received a search warrant issued by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, compelling the release of information related to Google accounts that have location history data in a specified geographical region and date time range. Google's response to the warrant included information about your account, meaning Google put a giant circle around a whole city and said any Google account that was within that geographic range, that did a Google search, that used Google Maps within that area, all of their account information was given to the government from merely being within that zone. And this basically says we couldn't tell you anything about it until now. Now that the state has sucked it all away, now we can tell you that it happened. A court order, this is a quote, a court order previously prohibited Google from notifying you of the legal process. We are now permitted to disclose the receipt of the legal process to you. The agency reference number or case number on the legal process is, and then it gives a case number. So that just happened this week. This is what a search warrant affidavit looks like when the government comes after your Facebook account. And these are just some of the, this is Google data requests, how exponentially they have been increasing over the years. This is requests for Facebook data, also exponential. This is how they get access to your Gmail. Unopened emails in your Gmail account are considered trash. They don't even need a search warrant to go after those. But finally, in the face of all that information, I want to remind us of the panopticon. The panopticon is a prison where they put a guard tower in the middle of it, and it's circular. Everything is circular. And at first, there are guards in the tower, and the prisoners see the guards in the tower. But then the panopticon, the idea of it is eventually there doesn't even have to be guards in the tower, because the prisoners act as if they are being guarded all the time. So they don't even have to actually guard them. We don't want a situation in the panopticon where we make the assumption that we're being guarded all the time. So we don't think, we don't write, we don't organize, we don't advocate, we don't speak up. Because if that's the case, then the government doesn't have to do anything to surveil us or to suppress us or repress us. We will do it ourselves. We will become our own censors, and that is an incredibly scary and sad day. So remember, Big Brother is watching, but also there are things that we can do. Just the last thing I'm going to cover, with regard to cell phones, your cell phone is the equivalent of 100,000 filing cabinets of confidential documents, according to the federal courts. And so your phone is your most significant vulnerability in terms of corporations or police stealing it, snatching it, seizing it, etc. The best thing that you can do with your phone if you see the cops coming for you is to power it completely off. This takes your short-term stuff that's stored in your cell phone and turns it into long-term storage, which is slightly harder for police forensic extraction devices to suck your stuff off. If your phone is unlocked, obviously everything is vulnerable. If it's locked but turned on, still a fair amount of data is compromised. Make sure you're using strong passphrases, but more importantly, like we talked about before, if something doesn't need to be on your phone, get rid of it. Upload it to your computer. Even upload it to a encrypted cloud platform if you need to. If it's on your phone, it's vulnerable. Take a moment, particularly when you're hitting the streets, to take as much off your phone as possible. That way, in the worst case scenario, if your phone is stolen by the state, harm reduction has occurred. They will get less bad stuff off your device that can cause harm to you and your community. Think about using encrypted tools like Signal, Keybase, CryptPad, VPNs and Tor. If you're using a search engine, you're making searches on the internet, think about whether or not you should use a VPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network, or Tor, which is called the Onion Router. These are basically ways to mask your IP address in the event that there is a need to do a secure search. As I just showed you, if you're using Google or Chrome as your browser, your computer's IP address would have been within that search warrant that I just showed you. And every search term, whether it's for misoprostol, whether it's for a pipeline, whether it's for a campus, all of that search information can be subject to search and seizure unless you are using a VPN or something like a Tor browser. Get off Google. We have an upcoming resource that is solely dedicated to why political activists need to get off of Google when engaging in political activism. CLDC.org is our website. We've got a lot more trainings and resources there. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation is also a great resource. And with that, questions, conversation, etc. Anybody?
So question from Jack. And I just want to remind folks that we are broadcasting live with KMUD. So please keep the language clean. Jack?
Thanks, Tony, but there's actually a hand up from Bella and Thomas.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. We'll go with Bella first.
Hi, sorry, it wasn't letting me unmute. But I wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It's been very informative. I was wondering, as a disabled activist and somebody who also has a community with disabled activists, I was wondering if there are any extra tips that you would have for how we interact with police, for example. If I have a question in terms of, like, I know some people will resist arrest by going limp, but personally, I have POTS, which is the condition that can make you faint. So something that I would be concerned about is that, like, I literally faint, but they think I'm, trying to resist, and then I'm charged with that. So I was just wondering, how do we communicate that with the cops, or just that whole situation?
That is a great question. Thank you. Well, first I will say that we actually did a Know Your Rights training for activists with disabilities, specifically, with some co-facilitators. And there's this organization called CREEC, CREEC. I will forget what the acronym fully stands for, but they are an organization that is focused on activists with disabilities on the streets who also want to protest. So that's a couple of, like, deeper dive resources. But in general, what I would say is, like, number one, law enforcement is required to comply with the ADA. They are required to accommodate people with disabilities, whether that means using ASL or bringing in an interpreter, or meeting people where they are with regard to disabilities. Specifically with regard to your question about passive resistance or fainting, in most states, passive resistance is not actually resisting arrest. This is a state-by-state issue. All cops, as part of their basic police academy training, are supposed to be trained in basic first aid and the ability to identify people who do have disabilities or have a health crisis going on. And so there should be a way for a cop to ascertain whether or not somebody is having a health issue or whether they are intentionally going limp. But I would say that there are obviously added risks to being arrested in a protest situation, including often it's a mass arrest situation. So there are many people being funneled into a jail. Jails are already, notorious for very poor medical care. If you need medications, if you need special equipment, you just may not get it, or you may not get it quickly, just because of the circumstances, in the staffing of a jail. But they are required to provide adequate medical care. They are required to accommodate people with disabilities.
And we have a question from Thomas. Thomas, if you could unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. I have a couple quick questions. First, where is CLDC located geographically?
Our home base is Eugene, Oregon, Kalapuya territory, but we also have staff in Humboldt, and we are hoping to actually open up an office down there in the next year or so.
Okay.
We do
in
cases
Hawaii,
all around
so
the
would
country.
you recommend? I was going to say, would it be possible, like in a situation where someone needs a lawyer, that we could contact your organization, or would you recommend us locating or identifying a local attorney who's sympathetic ahead of time?
I think it is always a really important idea for local political communities to create a stable of lawyers for themselves, to create, a group of ideally movement aligned lawyers that you can call on in your local community, both to do know your rights trainings, to interface with cops if needed, and that you can call on to defend people when needed, or to help organize legal teams when needed. One of the things that we do all around the country is, help form legal teams, especially when larger arrest scenarios go on. We call up public defender offices, we call up lawyers that we, get their names from networks, and you know, we're a small organization. We can't defend everyone, but we do take on precedent setting cases, you know, really important cases that we want to make sure, you know, result in wins. We're one of the very few organizations in the US that defend activists in criminal courts and sue cops and government agencies in civil courts for free. And so there is a huge demand on us often, but we're always willing to like take calls, give consultations, and try to help refer people to lawyers in their own communities. But like I said, you know, it's
Okay.
always worthwhile for your community
that's
to
good to
get
know.
together and find some lawyers locally too.
Yeah, I was, okay, public defenders and maybe CLU or something, but my second quick question is, I've raised this a comment to David Cobb earlier today. Looking ahead, I know I've heard the ACLU nationally claims they are already preparing for a possible Trump administration in which he arbitrarily criminalizes protest and just perhaps dissent of any kind. So what are you folks thinking into those terms, and what would you suggest to others based on your own thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's important for local communities and national organizations to be engaging in some scenario planning, just so that we can go through the process of doing that threat modeling that I showed you. But I also think it's really important to not focus on fear, you know, and to recognize that, you know, we've had tyrants and assholes, you know, in the White House many times before. And we've, you know, had Trump in office before, and it sucked for sure. But you know, I think that we need to maintain power in our numbers, and we don't want to be demobilizing or scaring people into submission by giving people like Trump too much power over our democracy and over our political environment. That's my general gist. There's way more to say about that. That could be its own, you know, own session probably. I would really encourage local communities to be, you know, thinking through what kind of networks, what kind of safety nets, what kind of resources they can put together in the event of a worst case scenario situation. You know, we have an adage, plan for the worst and hope for the best. That's definitely what we are doing here at the CLDC.
Lauren, there's a question in the chat, and it is, folks are wondering if you could speak a little bit about the current protests and how they're similar or different from some of the movement representation that you've been involved in. And
Meaning
yeah,
the encampments on campus?
yes, current student protests, and how does the fact that they are happening on campuses change things?
Well, I mean, the fact that many of them are located on colleges and universities means that protest is happening in what's called a quasi-public forum. You know, you have maximum First Amendment rights in a public forum, like public sidewalks, the courthouse steps, national forest lands. You know, those are all traditional public forums where we have maximum First Amendment rights. In a quasi-public forum, it's like one step down from that, which means there can be some areas where First Amendment rights are respected, but the university is allowed to come up with its own rules. And if you don't follow its rules, they're allowed to kick you out, you know, for not following their rules. And so, especially when it comes to non-students being present on a campus, it's easy for university administration to basically say only students and employees of the university are allowed here and members of the public are excluded. And then by just crossing the invisible line, a member of the community could be subject to trespassing just merely for like crossing that line. So that is a way for power, you know, for university administration to engage in a divide and conquer type tactic, in my opinion, you know, where they are trying to isolate students who are often newer and younger organizers and activists from potentially more experienced organizers and activists that might come from the community, but also by doubling the numbers, by allowing the community to come stand in solidarity with student organizers, that is increased power. There are resources that are brought to those protests that would otherwise be excluded by that separation. And that is, of course, really intentional. The other thing that I would say that I've been thinking about a lot lately in working with the students that we are working with all around the country is that, like, many of these students came of age during COVID, and during this global pandemic. Many of them didn't have a high school graduation, that they were on Zoom school. They had a lot of like isolation from being able to organize with each other hand in hand. And now those same people are being threatened with losing the ability to have a college graduation as well, with regard to like the student conduct proceedings, suspensions, the cancellation of graduation proceedings, and things like that. And I think that that is incredibly sad. And I think that the fact that we have young people standing up and being brave, being powerful, really leading our country and the world in taking a stance against genocide and the war in Gaza, is so incredibly brave and really speaks to the resilience and strength of these future leaders, and just really is heartening to me as, someone with over 30 years of movement organizing background.
We still have a few more minutes for maybe one or two questions if folks might have them in the audience. Well, I have one, Lauren, as someone who's been intimately involved in the protests, supporting the student protest movement. What advice would you give for students who are now going through that sanctioning process with the university? Not the criminal charges, but with the university. I know there are some students online here now that would appreciate having a little bit of insight into that.
Well, I would offer from my own perspective, and and I'm not an expert, but number one, be looking for the power structures attempts to divide and conquer. Isolating students and making them go into conduct proceedings one by one is meant to, disempower them, is meant to scare them. And so to the extent that people can organize together, even if it's before and after, just making sure that people feel the love and strength of their peers and of their allies and people supporting them. I think the outpouring, of faculty that have shown up for students is incredibly powerful and strong as we head into these proceedings. But the other thing that I would say is, and I don't want to sound glib about this, but this morning on Democracy Now, Juan basically spoke about being one of the leaders of the Columbia student protests in 1968. And he ended up not getting a diploma from Columbia. He ended up getting kicked out of school his senior year before graduating. And he was saying how it didn't stop him a lick in getting a job and having a career, and that people should not be, in fear and intimidated by the threat of, these school sanctions, because, and not let the university convince you that by being written up for a protest that your life is over, and that the brains that are in your head that led you to take a stance against Gaza and to stand up and be eloquent and organize and assert power, that those brains are somehow going to escape you because the ivory tower doesn't give you a piece of paper. You know, obviously there are economic and other consequences of getting kicked out of school. I don't want to be glib about that, of course, but we also don't want to give the monster too much, you know, power and control over our lives and over the current moment we're in. You know, it's been since 1968 that there has been such a horrific war, you know, that is deserving of this level of attention. You know, the amount of attention that has been drawn to Gaza because of universities around the world, you know, standing up and taking action can't be understated. So it's understandable that the powers that be will try to clamp down on that, you know, that will try to come down hard with the hope that it goes away and never comes back. But you know, you really want to counteract that and think about all the ways that you can hold your power and exercise your power, even in the face of grave consequences. Oh, good. And somebody put the link in today. Yeah, I really loved today's Democracy Now! Was fantastic. You know, I could never be as eloquent as Juan Gonzalez was in really concisely pinning what this protest movement means to the world today.
Well, it looks like we're out of time here. Lauren, I really want to thank you, my good friend Lauren, for giving us all of this really important information, this really critical period in history. And folks, if you'd like to reach Lauren, I think you can go to cldc.org and find their organization and their information. This was the fourth of 5 panels that are happening today with the Decolonizing Economics Conference. We are having another panel at 5 o'clock, a panel called Decolonizing Finance. This session is going to be real talk conversation between social change agents and catalytic impact investors. How can we rethink money and our relationship to it? How can we align our values and how we spend and how we invest? So we're going to have some great presenters there. Want to invite everyone to join us shortly. And thanks again, Lauren. Thanks again for everyone for joining us. And thanks
for having me.
Thanks, KMUD, and thanks, Free Speech TV.